President Joe Biden has just made a decision that will change the entire course of the Ukraine war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's much-vaunted victory plan required the United States to give the green light to a specific action that up until now the US hasn't allowed. America giving the go-ahead for this one thing would allow Ukraine to obliterate Russia by taking the fight directly to some of Russia's most important strategic assets. The US has spent the last 2.5 years hemming and hawing over this decision, but finally, it's happened. President Joe Biden has given Ukraine permission to strike Russia inside Russian territory using US-made and supplied long-range missiles. It's the last major act of a president who will soon leave the White House, and it's going to change the course of the war. And it's an act that's already benefited Ukraine. A mere day after the reports of permission being granted filed in, Ukraine took action. It launched the first of what will likely be many ATACMS missiles at Russia. This is massive news. In this video, we're going to examine the reasons behind Biden's decision to give the green light for ATACMS usage inside Russia before examining how Ukraine intends to use its missiles to obliterate the Russian Federation. The BBC was among the first to report on President Biden's decision. On November 18th, it delivered the basics. Biden had given the green light for ATACMS use inside Russia, the outlet said, in a major policy reversal. Previously, the use of these missiles had been restricted to targets inside Ukraine and in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, for fear that using them in Russia could escalate the war. CNN provides more details in its own report. It points out that the approval isn't official, in the sense that Biden's announced Ukraine's ability to use ATACMS missiles against Russia to the public. Rather, the news of the approval comes from a pair of US officials who are close to the president and familiar with the wrangling that's been going on surrounding ATACMS usage. One of those officials points out that the missiles are currently intended for use in Kursk in the wake of Russia's decision to deploy 50,000 troops to the oblast. Those 50,000 troops may include as many as 12,000 North Korean soldiers, which Putin has at his disposal thanks in large part to the Cooperative Defense Pact he signed with North Korean President Kim Jong-un back in July 2024. Biden's advisors believe that the arrival of these troops could spark a new phase of the war, according to CNN. So the ATACMS approval delivers more firepower to the Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk at a time when they're coming under intense pressure. Al Jazeera's diplomatic correspondent James Bays backs this reasoning up. He says that the aim of these Western nations is to support Ukraine, particularly in the area of Russia that Ukraine has occupied, Kursk. Why does Kursk matter? In August 2024, Volodymyr Zelensky made the unexpected decision to play Putin at his own game. Rather than focusing merely on the defense of the beleaguered Donetsk region inside Ukraine, he sent a small contingent of the country's troops into Russia's Kursk Oblast. A red line was crossed. Ukraine entered Russia, and in a matter of weeks, Ukraine was claiming that it held over 450 square miles of Russian territory, including 93 villages, thanks to its counter-invasion. The Kursk invasion marked a turning point in the war, with Ukraine's capture of Russian territory giving it a major bargaining chip should negotiations ever start with Putin. Ukraine now has the option of trading what it holds in Kursk for some of the territory Russia has taken during Putin's special military operation. Of course, that bargaining chip goes away if Ukraine isn't able to keep the territory it has in Kursk. Putin's deployment of 50,000 soldiers in a counteroffensive is supposed to retake the many settlements Ukraine has claimed. Ukraine needs to fight against that counteroffensive, which is where the ATACMS missiles come into play. With them, Ukraine can launch strikes against Russian and North Korean positions in Kursk from within its own borders. That's huge for Ukraine. It's now able to support its soldiers on the ground with missile strikes that Russia can't easily counter. Back to CNN's report. It also notes that the approval of ATACMS use in Russia has been a long time coming. The US outright refused to send the missiles to Ukraine, even for use within its own territory, for the first 2 years of the war. Escalation of the war was the main fear at the time. The US was wary of what Putin might do in response to sending such powerful missiles to Ukraine. CNN also notes that some within the United States also worried about the US eating into stockpiles of ATACMS, essentially reducing its ability to defend itself in return for arming Ukraine. President Biden reversed that policy in February 2024, enabling the first ATACMS systems to enter Ukraine in April. But even then, the edict was clear. Ukraine was only to use the missiles to attack Russian positions within its own territory. Crimea could be included in that list, given that the US doesn't recognize Russia's 2014 annexation of the peninsula, meaning it should still be be owned by Ukraine, but attacks on Russia itself were a no-go. President Zelensky had pressed long and often to get the go-ahead to use the missiles against Russia, even before the US allowed them to be used inside Ukraine. There were signs that the approval was on its way several months before it came. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported on what it called a faint glimmer of hope for Ukraine after months of Zelensky's haranguing for permission to use ATACMS missiles against Russia. Biden responded, "We're working that out right now." When asked about lifting his geographic restrictions, the president's Secretary of State Antony Blinken also noted that the US has continuously adjusted and adapted based on battlefield conditions. The signs were there that approval was incoming. Putin's decision to use North Korean troops in his counteroffensive against the Ukrainian positions in Kursk appears to have pushed President Biden to make his decision. After all, Putin's use of North Korean soldiers represents the type of escalation the US always feared. Now it needs to help Ukraine counter that escalation with stronger weapons. Zelensky finally has what he's wanted for over 2 years, and Russia isn't happy. Putin has already made several threats against the US as it deliberated over whether to permit Ukraine to use ATACMS inside Russia. Toward the end of September 2024, less than 2 weeks after President Biden and Blinken's comments about considering ATACMS usage, Putin was on the warpath. It's proposed that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state, be considered as their joint attack on the Russian Federation. Putin raged during a September meeting of Russia's Security Council. The use of the word nuclear was very intentional. Putin was essentially saying that Russia would consider the US permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russia as an attack conducted by a nuclear nation. And even though those missiles won't carry nuclear warheads, Russia reserved the right to respond to such conventional missile strikes with nuclear weapons. In short, don't do it, America. We'll use nukes if you let Ukraine use your missiles against us. The Russian response has been no less muted now that President Biden has given his approval. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, was one of the first to respond. If such a decision was really formulated and brought to the attention of the Kyiv regime, this is a qualitatively new round of tension and a qualitatively new situation in terms of the involvement of the United States in the conflict, he said when speaking to Russian media. Of course, Peskov's statements ignore the fact that Russia had already escalated with its decision to use North Korean troops against Ukraine in Kursk. But that hypocrisy has never stopped the Kremlin from making threats against the US before. Russian lawmaker Maria Butina also warned that President Biden's actions would lead to a massive escalation. However, she also pointed to Russia's hope that President-elect Donald Trump would overturn Biden's decision. "I have a great hope that Trump will overcome this decision if this has been made, because they are seriously risking the start of World War III," claimed Butina. Peskov has also made mention of the outgoing administration in Washington and its intention to add fuel to the fire in the war. So it appears Russia may be hoping that Donald Trump will come to their rescue and save the country from ATACMS missiles. Whether that will actually happen, President-elect Trump's proposed peace plan could prevent escalation, remains to be seen. It's also worth noting that President Biden's decision hasn't been met with universal approval from other nations in Europe. Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia have all condemned the decision, perhaps because they believe that using ATACMS missiles in Russia will escalate tensions to the point where other European countries are threatened. Politico also reports that one French military official says that permitting Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles will not change the balance of power in the war. It will merely slow down rather than stop what the official views as an industrial war, in which the nation that can produce the most weapons in the long run is the most likely to win. It's difficult to determine whether those comments amount to French disapproval of President Biden's decision or not. Still, it doesn't matter, the decision has been made. And perhaps it's President Zelensky who provides the most telling response to Biden's decision. Reacting to the news, he said, "Today there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions. But strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves." The last statement is telling. Zelensky's suggesting that all of the talk is meaningless because Ukraine has the permission it needs. And with that, we come to a key question. Why is Russia so afraid of America's ATACMS missiles? We only need to look at the missile's specs to find the answer. Al Jazeera provides some details about the ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System, in its report about Biden's decision. It says they were first developed in the 1980s, with the missiles having a 190-mile range that allows them to be launched from within Ukraine to strike Russian territory. They're built by Lockheed Martin and are launchable by both the HIMARS systems the US has sent to Ukraine in July 2022 and the M270 multiple launch rocket systems Ukraine received from the UK in the same year. In other words, Ukraine already has everything it needs to fire the ATACMS. It just needed permission to use them how it wanted. Missile Threat provides more details, noting that the ATACMS is a single-stage missile that can be loaded with a high explosive or blast fragmentation warhead, the latter of which packs up to 950 submunitions, allowing for powerful scattershot attacks against Russian positions. The mention of HIMARS in the M270 system should also clue you into the fact that the ATACMS is a road mobile missile that allows Ukraine to launch from almost anywhere within its territory. That's what will make it so useful for countering Russia's Kursk offensive. Ukraine can literally drive its ATACMS missiles to the border it shares with Russia and launch both into the territory it's taken and the positions that Russian and North Korean troops have established on Kursk's outskirts. The ATACMS is also designed for precision. 4 tail fins located on its rear keep it stable while it's in flight, with the nose cone at the front doing the same. The missile also combines GPS and an inertial navigation system, or INS, that allows it to fly directly to its intended target while minimizing collateral damage. The INS system also offers protection against interference and electronic jamming, meaning Russia will need to rely on its S-300 and S-400 anti-air systems to shoot it out of the skies. Given that the ATACMS can reach speeds of up to Mach 3, hitting it while it's in flight is a pretty tall order. In short, it's an extremely powerful missile, the likes of which Russia hasn't needed to contend with for much of the war. Outside of a handful of strikes in Crimea, with one taking place in June 2024 that killed at least 4 Russians and injured a further 151, Ukraine hasn't been able to get the most out of its ATACMS missiles. Now it can. And it's that fact that terrifies Putin. So we come to another question. What does Ukraine's new ability to use ATACMS missiles against Russia mean for the future of the war? It's all bad news for Russia. And Ukraine has already given us one of the answers. On November 19th, the BBC reported that US officials had confirmed that Ukraine has launched the first of its ATACMS missiles at Russia. The strike involved 5 missiles, all targeting the Bryansk region, according to Russia's defense ministry. Of those 5, 1 managed to make it through Russia's anti-air defenses, with fragments of the exploded missile causing a fire at a military facility in the border oblast. At least that's according to Russia. The US officials who confirmed the attack say that the numbers are much different. Ukraine actually fired 8 missiles, only 2 of which Russia managed to intercept. This suggests that 6 got through, likely causing far more damage than Russia would like to admit. Reuters followed up the BBC's report, noting that Ukraine is now claiming that it managed to strike a Russian arms depot located 70 miles deep into the Bryansk region. The attack was also accompanied by a drone strike, targeting at least 8 southern and central regions. Russia's defense ministry claims it shot down 42 of the drones, along with 4 of 5 ATACMS missiles. Whatever the truth may be, the Kremlin was quick to respond to the news. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov immediately accused the United States of escalating a conflict of which it shouldn't have any part. That ATACMS was used repeatedly overnight against the Bryansk region is of course a signal that they, meaning the United States, want escalation, Lavrov claimed. He then made the chilling claim that Russia would proceed with any future decisions from the understanding that Ukraine's ATACMS were operated by American military experts. And this attack may just be the start of Ukraine's ATACMS offensive. As mentioned earlier, Putin has amassed around 50,000 soldiers, including troops from North Korea, to drive out the Ukrainian occupiers in the Kursk Oblast. That counteroffensive is going poorly for Russia. On November 12th, Forbes military expert David Axe reported that Ukraine had already destroyed 77 Russian armored vehicles during the first 6 days of the counteroffensive. Most of those were along the northern edge of the territory Ukraine holds in the oblast. And to make matters worse for Putin, those reports came amidst others claiming that Ukraine had killed 1,950 Russian soldiers and destroyed over 100 armored vehicles in a single day across the entire 800-mile front line. The new voice of Ukraine says that Russia has resorted to flattening their own troops and killing their own citizens by essentially carpet-bombing the areas in Kursk that Ukraine holds. Russia has shelled the territory 11,578 times, the media outlet claims, in addition to dropping 3,243 guided aerial bombs and 356 unguided missiles onto Kursk. That's where Ukraine's ATACMS weapons come into play again. Russia can blanket Kursk with bombs from fortifications it's built outside the new front line Ukraine created when it invaded Kursk. Previously, there was little Ukraine could do about this, beyond holding its ground against the constant bombing. But with permission to use ATACMS inside Russia, comes the ability to target the airfields and launching locations Russia has used to attack Kursk so intently. With some of those locations destroyed, the Ukrainian troops on the ground can focus on defending themselves against the 50,000-strong counteroffensive, significantly raising their chances of holding Kursk for the long run. And it's not just bases near Kursk that Ukraine can attack. it has so many more potential targets to strike with ATACMS that would relieve pressure across the entire front line. In the wake of Biden's approval, the Kyiv Post noted that having access to ATACMS could allow Ukraine to strike over 245 military objects. These objects include 15 air bases, with some of the most prominent being in the Bryansk, Kursk, Lipetsk, Rostov, and Kaluga regions. It's a massive upgrade on the rockets Ukraine previously launched from their HIMARS, which could only travel 50 miles and hit 20 of the 245-plus potential targets ATACMS can reach. And Ukraine has already proven it can hit Bryansk with its November 19th strike. Back to the airfields, they matter because they're what Russia uses to launch its terrifying glide bombs, predominantly made using Russia's Soviet-era Fab 1500 bombs, which weigh about 1.65 tons. Glide bombs are made using a special upgrade kit that costs as little as $20,000. That kit essentially equips Russia's old bombs with wings, allowing its aircraft to launch them from behind the front lines so they can glide to targets in Ukraine. Russia has buffeted Ukraine with these bombs. March 2024 alone saw Russia send around 3,000 glide bombs Ukraine's way, and many more thousands have hit Ukraine since. As for why they're so dangerous, you only need to compare a glide bomb to a standard artillery shell. A Russian 152mm shell contains around 14 pounds of explosive. The country's 1.65-ton glide bomb packs an enormous 440 pounds of explosive into their massive shells, giving each bomb over 31 times the destructive power of an artillery shell. The one downside to glide bombs, from the Russian perspective, is that they need to be launched from the air. A plane has to take off, hit a suitable altitude, and position itself appropriately before launch. For that, Russia needs airfields from which these planes can take off, which brings us right back to the 15 airfields Ukraine can now target with its ATACMS. Taking just one of those airfields out drastically reduces Russia's ability to safely launch glide bombs from behind the front lines. Taking out several would massively relieve the intense pressure Russia has placed on Ukraine in its push to take Donetsk. Again, we'll see a similar result to what the ATACMS will achieve in Kursk. Less fire from above, allowing Ukrainian ground troops to counter Russia's offensive maneuvers on the ground. Beyond the airfields, you also have to consider what other Russian assets fall within the 245-plus objects the Kyiv Post identifies. For instance, many of those assets are likely storage units Russia uses to keep its troops supplied on the front lines in Ukraine. Taking these storage facilities out would mean Russia is less able to equip its troops on the ground. ATACMS strikes may also allow Ukraine to destroy Russian tanks and artillery units before they're deployed to the front, again relieving pressure on its soldiers in Donetsk. So the ATACMS isn't just a glide bomb destroyer. It's a missile that allows Ukraine to disrupt Russian supply lines that it couldn't previously reach. Timothy Ash, who's a Chatham House Associate Fellow, says as much when he tells Al Jazeera, Ukraine needs to be able to hit Russian supply chains, which it's moved back beyond current Ukrainian missile range. That's another good point. The Ukraine war's front lines now extend so deep into the Donbas region that Ukraine's short-range HIMARS rockets aren't even able to hit Russian positions inside its own territory. The 50-mile range doesn't allow it. With ATACMS, Ukraine can start by taking out Russia's logistical assets near the outskirts of its own country before moving on to tackle the many Russian objects the Kyiv Post mentions. Ash goes on to point out that simply having the ability to use ATACMS on Russian territory gives Ukraine something very important: leverage. That's what Ukraine wanted to create when it invaded Kursk, and it gets even more now it's able to use ATACMS. As Ash points out, Biden may have made his decision intending to deliver more leverage to Zelensky in future negotiations with Putin. Once the capability has been given, it's harder to take away, he notes. Putin will want to negotiate limits on Ukraine's military capabilities. If Zelensky and Putin ever do find themselves at the negotiating table, perhaps Ukraine's president can use his ATACMS to force Putin into reducing his use of glide bombs or pulling back from various regions in Donetsk. Therein may lie the main reason behind Biden granting approval to use ATACMS so late into his presidency. Ash says, it looks like Russia will escalate over the next couple of months before the Trump presidency and likely negotiations. It's already doing precisely that if his actions in Kursk are anything to go by. Introducing soldiers from another country in his special military operation is an escalation beyond anything we've seen Putin do since February 2022. So Ukraine needs to be able to hit longer range to dent Russia's offensive capabilities, Ash concludes. Notably, Trump has already called on Russia not to escalate the conflict any further. Putin ignored those calls, but that's unlikely to dissuade Trump from pushing for peace when he takes office in January 2025. Ukraine may welcome any negotiations Trump can mediate, but it'll want to enter those negotiations from a position of power, which means using ATACMS not just as leverage, but as a tool to weaken Russia in the 2 months before Trump takes office. Speaking of escalation, that's precisely what occurred in the wake of reports of Biden's decision. Before Ukraine's November 19 attack, Russia marked the 1,000th day of the war by changing up its nuclear doctrine. Now it says that any attack conducted by a non-nuclear state such as Ukraine, if backed by a nuclear power such as the US, will constitute a joint attack on Russia. And with that change, Putin has opened the door for Russia to use nukes in response to Ukraine's ATACMS usage. Will he go that far? Only time will tell. As for Zelensky, Biden's policy reversal is massive news for his country's brave military. It also takes him one step closer to enacting the victory plan he presented to the US back in October. If nothing else, Biden's move takes Ukraine one step closer to resolving things with Russia, be that on the battlefield or diplomatically. The latter seems to be Zelensky's preferred option as he awaits Donald Trump's arrival in office. The Hindu reported on an interview he gave to Ukrainian radio just days before Biden's policy reversal. "For our part, we must do everything we can to ensure that this war ends next year," Zelensky said. "We have to end it by diplomatic means. ATACMS trained on key Russian locations may give Ukraine the leverage it needs to do just that. But as Ukraine's November 19th strike demonstrates, Zelensky is far from shy about using his missiles to hit Russia where it hurts right now." So what do you think about Biden's decision to allow Ukraine to use the ATACMS on Russian targets? Will it allow Ukraine to negotiate a better deal for itself when Donald Trump becomes president and enact his peace plan? Or will Putin escalate from here, making the US regret its decision in the process? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video.